We started the Brisker Rov on Hilchas Chametz U'Matzah Perek Zayin Halacha Tes, and we got very involved in a paragraph that starts V'hanira Lomar. So what I'd like to do is first summarize some of the highlights of that paragraph and review what we already know and how to define, according to the Brisker Rav, the understanding of the Rambam Shita in Arba Kosos. When I say Rambam, I mean Rambam plus Rif, as opposed to Tosfos. Tosfos at the beginning of Arvi Pesachim, as we've said 1,000,001 times, is of the opinion that we could identify Dalid Kosos as Kosos Shel Bracha, to the extent to which that Tosfos understood from the Mishnah that we don't have to supply every member of the household with his own personal set of Dalid Kosos, but rather we give Dalid Kosos to the Bala Bayit, and he will be Motzi as Kulam Bishalo. And Tosfos goes ahead and compares Dalid Kosos to Kiddush, where one person recites Kiddush on behalf of the entire family. So it means that Tosfos rejects the concept of Shtia. He refuses, Tosfos, to identify the essence of the mitzvah of Arba Kosos as a mitzvah of Shtia, but rather, Tosfos prefers to identify and define the mitzvah of Dalid Kosos as a koshel bracha. Kiddush, for example, as a paradigmic koshel bracha, only requires amiras habracha lakos with te'ima. And the te'ima is meant to relate and connect his amiras habracha to the kos, but there's no separate requirement of shtia. And the Brisker Rav quotes his father, Reb Chaim, who was very surprised by this Tosfos, because Reb Chaim understood, and he proved it, that the essence of the mitzvah of Dalid Kosos is actually the drinking of the Kosos. And he says the following, that Tosfos, even in Arba Kosos, where the mitzvah is not fundamentally the Shtia Sakos, but rather Bracha on a Kos, and therefore it's exactly identical to Kiddush the whole year round, and to any Koshel Bracha, this really, in a sense, undermines the whole concept of Cherus, right? We wanted to suggest that when the Gemara says Yidei Cherus lo yatsa, it indicates that Cherus is essential to the definition of the mitzvah of Dalid Kosos, and therefore Shtia is what demonstrates the Cherus. So the Dalid Kosos go way beyond the Koshel Bracha. You can have 4 Koshel Bracha and recite on each Kos of Bracha, but that doesn't demonstrate Cherus. Amiras HaBracha is not Cherus. Cherus is a result of drinking, and that's why we require that the Yayin be Yayin Mazug, and that's why we require Heseba when he drinks the wine. All this is to establish the Shtia as a demonstration of Cherus. And that's part of the mitzvah of Leil HaPesach, of Chayav Adam Leharos Esatzmo Kiluhu Yotze Mitzrayim. Now, the Gaon in Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim Simon Reish Ayin Aleph, as we saw yesterday, quotes a machlokes between the Rosh and Tosfos regarding a koshel kiddush. So my suggestion is that we read this inside. Do you remember by chance where exactly we got up to? I think we got up to the word ulam here. I think I have a note. Okay, but this part is a little more complicated. I think it's worth our while to review it. So again, we're on the bottom of page 14, on the right side, the left side on the bottom. And we could count up about 10 lines from the bottom, Mevuar, and the line starts Midivrei Agra. So what's going on over here? We have a kos shel kiddush, and the issue is regarding the shear, the minimum volume of shtia minakos in the case of kiddush, which is called mole lugmav. Can we apply the principle of shtios shnayim mitztarfos? So Ruvain, who let's say was the Makadesh, drank half of mole lugmav, and Shimon, who was amongst those who were at the table, he drank another half of mole lugmav. Satosa says that you're yotze, and shtios shnayim mitztarfos. But the Rosh says, I'm going to prove to you from the Gemara in Pesachim that ain't shtias shnayim mitztarefes. And his proof is from the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos, because the Gemara says in Pesachim Kuf Chesam and Beis that who de ishte ruba de kosa, that he has to give to the bnei bayis to drink. And it seems that every single member of the bnei bayis has to drink. And Tosfos is going to have to interpret that Gemara as saying that all of them together will have to drink what's called rov kos, whereas the Rosh understood that each one of the Bnei Abayis will have to drink personally rov kos. And that's how the Gaon, in his commentary on Orach Chaim, understands the machlokas regarding Kiddush, if shtia shnayim mitztarefes. His proof is based on an analogy between Kiddush and Dalid Kosos. Shmamina, the Sfirla Agra, the Ein Tzarech Lishtos Bi Atzma Arba Kosos. This whole issue, whether you can be mitzaref or not, is based on the assumption that not every person has to drink personally. If every person has to drink personally, then there's no Havamina, there's no possibility of tziruf. The tziruf is based on the fact that we don't require each person to drink himself. And the Rosh is building his case on with regard to Kiddush on the basis of Arba Kosos. And that means that the Rosh understood that if I can prove from Dalit Kosos one way or the other whether shtios mitztarfos or not, it's because in the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos, there's no requirement that each person has to drink himself, but rather it's treated and defined as a regular, classic kloshel bracha, and we can give to others to drink from the kos, as long as someone drinks from the kos. Okay. He says the following. In Cain, now we're on page Ches, which is the equivalent of 15, about 10 lines down. In Cain, Harei mevur lehedja de ikar mitzvah shel arba kosos hi habrachos she'ala kosos. Ushtiyasam hi kechol shtiyas koshel bracha. Delo ichpas lon im amavarich atz biatzmo shoso acher. So it means that if you're going to hold that there's a machlokus where the shtios mitztarfos, and we're going to define and determine the answer to that question of shtios mitztarfos based on Dalit Kosos, it must mean that we don't care and we don't have to single out one person in particular, like the Makadesh, to drink the kos. Otherwise, there's no issue about shtios mitztarfos. But rather, we're dealing with a koshel bracha, and the shtia of a koshel bracha is a din in the kos, that the kos has to be drunk. You have to drink from the kos, but there's no obligation on the gavra to engage in shtia. Now, again, keep in mind that the Gaon, in his analysis of whether or not shtios mitztarfos, which he anchors in the halach of Dalit Kosos, that's only as far as Tosfos and the Rosh is concerned. And they were of the opinion that in Dalit Kosos, one person could be motzi someone else, right? We only have to supply one person with Dalit Kosos, just like in any koshel bracha. So that the Shita, Tosas, and the Rush is that Dalit Kosos is a koshel bracha, which means that there's no requirement of shtia. There's only requirement, like in any koshel bracha, that the bracha will be chal on the kos once there was someone drinking from the kos, and that someone might be a group of people that are mitztarfos. However, the Brisker Rav points out, ulam nired davar zeh b'machloke shnuya, that despite the fact that the Gaon understood this according to Tosfos and the Rush, but not everybody agrees, and not even the Bali Tosfos, because he says the Hine Tosfos b'Pesachim Daf Kuf Zayin, they're of the opinion that the shiur of Moli Lugmav, which is defined by an Adam Beinani, is Rov Revius. And Tosfos says, Midamrina L'Kamon, he quotes the Sugya on Daf Kuf Ches, Behu de Ishti Ruba de Kosa, Alma de Ruba de Kosa, who Moli Lugmav. L'chein Kosa v'divrayim L'Kamon Daf Kuf Ches, Tehad Kamer Gemara Ruba de Kosa, Hainu Kimoli Lugmav. Ayin Shom v'divrayim Muvur Mizeh. What does the Brisker Rav see here? The Sfir Leila Tosfos, the Gam Gabi Arba Kosos Iker Shir Ashtia Midina Hu Moli Lugmav Kigon Kimo Gabi Koshel Kiddush. So Tosfos identifies the shear of Rov Kos in Dalit Kosos as Moli Lugmav, which is the identical shear that's required in a Kos Shel Bracha like Kos Shel Kiddush. And there we need only Te'ima, and Te'ima's Moli Lugmav. And that applies to every koshel bracha. V'hadik Amar Bagmara Hacha Ruba de Kosa Lav Dinahu. Don't take the Gemara literally that you need Rov Kos, because Tosfos points out all you need is Moli Lugmav. You don't need Rov Kos. And why is the shear of Dalit Kos Moli Lugmav? Because Tosfos of the opinion that the shear of Moli Lugmav is the shear of shtia, or more precisely of te'ima, with regard to any koshel bracha. And the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos is koshel bracha. Ubiog melech haboshem be'emes be'inon tfei miruba. So certainly, Rov Kos might be a lot more than Moli Lugmav. Imagine you have a small guy, and he can hardly fill up his cheeks, with much of a volume of liquid because he's relatively small. So as far as Moli Lugmav is concerned, he could be Yotzei any koshel bracha with Moli Lugmav. But is that Rov Kos? You're going to have a very small kos. And in the opposite direction, let's say you have Og Melech HaBashon, then for him, he might have to drink all the kos, not just Rov Kos, not 51%, but 100% of the kos, because his Moli Lugmav is a greater volume than everyone else's. So we see that the din of Rov Kos is not the same as Moli Lugmav. In classic koshel bracha, the shear of shtia, which is really team, is Moli Lugmav. But in Dalit Kosos, the Gemara says you need Rov Kos, which may be a lot more than a small guy and a lot less than a big guy. So how does Rov Kos fit in to Dalit Kosos if we assume that Dalit Kosos are Kosos Shel Bracha? However, the Rambam says, Perek Zayin Halacha Tes, Im Shasa Mikol Kos Mehen Rubo Yatza. The Rambam has completely omitted any mention whatsoever Moli Lugmav, which he mentions in Kiddush, and is the requirement in any koshel bracha. All of a sudden, instead of mentioning Moli Lugmav, he speaks about Rov Kos. V'lo hizkir klal hacha shiur de Moli Lugmav k'mo gabi Kiddush. So he's comparing the Rambam in Perek Chavtas mi Hilchas Shabbos to the Rambam in Perek Zayin Milchus Chometz U'Matzah. In Perek Chav Tes Milchus Shabbos in Kiddush, the Rambam requires Molei Lugmav, and in Hilchus Chometz U'Matzah Perek Zayin, with regard to Daled Kosos, he requires Rov Kos, not Molei Lugmav. Mashma. So Brisker Rav from this diuk wants to derive the conclusion. The Svirle, the Rambam holds, the Rak Abi Kiddush, the Avi Shir Ti'imoso, it's only a Shir Te'ima, there's no mitzvah Shtia, is sufficient. Molei Lugmav. Aval Gabi Arba Kosos, the Rambam Dafka requires Rov Kos, and Molei Lugmav might not be enough, again, depending on how small he is, how big he is. V'cheni Gam Shitas Ramban. So again, Tosfos is going to identify Molei Rov Kos as Molei Lugma. And Rov Kos is really the shear of Molei Lugmav and Adam Beinani. So all this is Tosfos L'Shitaso, Tosfos being very consistent, because Tosfos identifies Daled Kosos as Koshel Bracha. If the shear of Shtia of Koshel Bracha, which is really just Te'ima is Molei Lugmav, then Huadin, the same thing, but Huatam, the same logic should apply to Daled Kosos. So Rov Kos in the Gemara of Daled Kosos means Molei Lugmav. But now we have two dissenting Rishonim. There's the Rambam, and there's the Ramban. And the Rambam differentiates between Rov Kos as the shear of Daled Kosos and Molei Lugmav as the shear of Kiddush and Koshel Bracha. And the Ramban, according to the Brisker Rav, likewise holds that in Arba Kosos you need Dafka Ruba de Kosa. How do we know that the Ramban belongs to the camp of the Rambam against Tosfos and assumes that Molei Lugmav is a different shear that Rov Kos is a different shear than Molei Lugmav? And the answer is that according to Ramban, in Makos Gadol, you have a very, very large glass, umachzik kama revios. Wow, kama revios. That's an awesome volume of yayin. Tzarich lishtos dafka rov kos. Now imagine, Molei Lugmav is a small amount of wine. Now he's got many revios in this gigantic cup. And the Ramban insists that he drink rov kos, way beyond Molei Lugmav. Like we saw in the Rambam. Right? So if you have a kos gadol, Shemachzik Kamer Revios, then he cannot fulfill his mitzvah by drinking Molei Lugmav, even though there's Kamer Revios there, but he has to drink Rov Kos. So we see clearly that according to the Ramban, Daled Kosos has its own shear of Rov Kos. I'm not sure if that means ipso facto that the mitzvah of Daled Kosos is shtia. Let's just think about that for a minute. Just gonna change my, sorry. See, I'm wondering out loud, is the Brisker Rav operating with only two definitions? It's either bracha lakos or shtias hakos. And if it's bracha lakos, then we don't understand the Ramban, because then the shir is moli lugmov, and the Ramban says it's rov kos, which may be a lot more than moli lugmov. Therefore, only by process of elimination, we know that the Ramban identifies the mitzvah of Daled Kosas as shtir. Or maybe the Brisker Rav is saying something even more than that the concept of rov kos itself is indicative of shtir. Does that resonate at all? That rov kos means shtias hakos. L'chorah not. I mean, I could argue that even if the mitzvah is not shtir, but rather brach ala kos, but the brach has to be related to the kos, and we need a din of rov. But that rov kos, which effectuates a connection between the bracha and the kos, yeah, but I mean, it definitely proves that Daled Kos is a different halacha than Koshel Bracha.
I mean, Rov Kos can only be one person.
Right.
But Malei Lugma can be multiple people.
I think that's correct, but the only question I have, Steve, did the Ramban actually commit himself to that position that Rov Kos has to be one person? I mean, the Brisker Rav definitely understood that, but is that really what the Ramban is saying? I mean, I know that the Ramban is requiring Rov Kos, but what about Shtios Mitztarfos? The Brisker Rav would, by definition, exclude such a possibility, because Shtios Mitztarfos is based on the assumption that it's a Koshel Bracha. The Brisker Rav understood from the Ramban's requirement of Rov Kos that he's not defining Daled Kosas as Kosa Shel Bracha, and therefore there's no din of Shtias Mitztarfos. But I'm playing the devil's advocate here. I want you to convince me beyond a shadow of a doubt that if the Ramban says that in Daled Kosas you need Rov Kos, which could be many, many revios, if you have such a large kos, that the Ramban is definitely defining the mitzvah of Daled Kosas as shtir. You understand what I'm doing here? I'm trying to play the devil's advocate here. Can we disagree with the Brisker Rav and say the Ramban requires Rov Kos? See, presumably, I don't even know if that's explicit in the Ramban, a Koshel Bracha only requires Mole Lugmav. I mean, that's his assumption. It would really be sharp if we found Rishonim, maybe the Ramban even, who would hold that the shir of Kiddush is Rov Kos and not Mole Lugmav. What was the? I mean, we've been assuming all along that a koshel bracha only requires mali lugma. Oh, that I think we said that's a sugyan brachos, if I'm not mistaken. That there's a sugya like that. I'm just wondering if anybody of any scholarly status would say that a koshel bracha requires rov kos, or that could only be by daled kosas. So again, I don't want to belabor this point, but I'm not sure. In my mind, there's a gap here which I don't know how to traverse. That just because you require of kos, that means that the mitzvah is shtia, or say it the other way around, that if the mitzvah is shtia, then you require of kos. I understand that there's no other way to go, but just the logic of it, I don't understand the connection so well. Anyway, he says, Harei leheja, the ein ashir moli lugmav, the shear of Dalit Kos is not moli lugmav, even rov kos, fine. Kain kos of leheja ran, beper gavne pesachim, lechalik ben kiddush, darba kosos, to gabi kiddush shear at the imo moli lugmav, Dafka Ruba de Kosa. So even if it's, again, it could be the Brisker Rav is saying the following, even if it's not explicit in the Ramban that a kos shel kiddush requires moli lugmav, but nevertheless the Ran says it explicitly. And the Ran sets up a contrast between kiddush and arba kosas, whereas kiddush requires moli lugmav, dalit kosas require ruba de kosa, rov kos. The simple way of explaining the reasoning, the inu sphirle, the gam gabi kiddush, the rak gabi kiddush, v'shar kos shel bracha, the iker milsayu ya bracha al kos, el the dinu da mavarech tzarch sheyitom, we said that anyone could drink from the kos. I'm not sure what those words mean. But zeu dahavi shi'ur kemole lugmav. Avol gabi arba kosos da mitzvah ishtias hakos. Tzorech lishtos kulo dafka. Rakte berubo sagi bisharuba de kulo. So do you see how he defines it? He doesn't say that mitzvah shtia. He says that mitzvah shtias hakos. I think he's being very medayik here in his lashon. Because there's nothing compels me to draw a conclusion from A to B, from A, the fact that you need Rav Kos, to B, that there's mitzvah shtia. But if you add that one word, that the mitzvah shtias hakos, so it's not just that the Gavra had a shtia in terms of the volume of wine that came down his gullet, but rather that the shtia has to be min hakos. So if that be the case, then you have to drink the entire kos, or rove that has a din of kula. See, if he just would have said shtia, I'm not sure that would be enough to justify rove kos. And also comment the following, that if we're going to completely sever the connection between the brachos on the kosos and the shtia, then in the case of Sheson v'vasachas, where he didn't recite the brachos at all, he should be able to be yotzei his mitzvah of daled kosos. And yet the Rambam writes that in the case of Sheson v'Vasachas, lo yatsa. So again, I'm just pointing out that I think it would be a mistake, a critical error, if we identified the mitzvah of dalikosos as shtia with the Rambam. There's got to be more than just shtia, because son vasachas is shtia. The Rambam says yidei abrakosos lo yotza. So we're going to have to say that there are two dinim here. There's the kiyum of koshel bracha, and each one dalikosos requires some bracha, as opposed to son vasachas. And now, in addition to setting up the bracha on each kos, you have a mitzvah shtias hakos, and shtias hakos means rov kos. V'rak beruba sagi mishum deruba kekulo, aval shiura demoli lugmav lo shayach hocha klal. Why? Because that's only a shir in koshel bracha, and all you need is te'ima and not shtia.
So the shtia is, you need that because you need to demonstrate the cherus.
I think. Because again, what other element are we going to add to the equation besides koshel bracha? I don't know of another element that I can identify. It's got to be cherus. And the cherus requires shtia. The bracha is not going to cut the mustard for you. You need shtia. But the Brisker Rav is learning here in the Ramban and in the Ran that you need, and also I think in the Rambam. Just 1 second. That you need Rov Kos. In Dalit Kosos, the shear of Moli Lugmav is not sufficient, even though shear of Moli Lugmav equals Te'ima, which is enough for any koshel bracha. Again, you could always ask the following question: what would the Rambam, the Ramban, and the Ran say? V'haya, that he only drank Moli Lugmav from each of the Dalit Kosos. So I understand that he would not be able to the mitzvah dalit kosos, but insofar as there's an element of bracha here, and that's why the Rambam says shesam vasachas lo yatsi de dalit kosos, then perhaps the kiyum of koshel bracha vis-a-vis each one of the 4 kosos, he would have fulfilled, even though he didn't drink rov kos, he only drank moli lugmav. In other words, the Brisker Rav is making a big deal about the fact that in Dalit Kosos, we don't apply and graft the universal shear of Moli Lugmav that applies to every koshel bracha. And therefore, you're going to require a new shear, which is Rov Kos. But is he denying the status of Moli Lugmav, completely rejecting that status with regard to Dalit Kosos? I'm not sure. Could be that there's halacha of Moli Lugmav even in Dalit Kosos, insofar as he recited a bracha on each one of the 4 kosos. But maybe the Brisker Rav would argue that that's not really part of the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos. That's a separate mitzvah of koshel bracha. It happens to be on Leil Pesach. We have 4 such kosos. But I think, again, I would argue that Moli Lugmav is not meaningless. It's not zippo. Because he does recite a bracha on each one of the 4 kosos. Now what would be in the case of Sheson Vas Achas and he only drank Moli Lugmav? That would be meaningless. That would not score any brownie points whatsoever. Because Mimonefsha. If it's Dalit Kosos, you need Shtia, which is Rov Kos. And if it's Koshel Bracha, he drank these 4 kosos Posechers immediately without reciting the brachos. below hocha, but not here in Dalit Kosas to be in Shtiyas Hakos, we should mitzvah ken kos of Abach. Vel konim avur mi said the kulu hana Ravasa, meaning the Rambam, the Ramban, and the Ran, Svirlahu, the Ikar mitzvah shel Dalit Kosos. Again, consistently, I think in the other Sfarim that we looked at, including the Amudei Hod, I think it said Shtia. I don't know if it said Shtias HaKos. Because again, keep in mind, the Brisker Rav is trying to justify this unique sheer in Dalit Kosas of Shtias Rov Kos. So therefore, it's not enough to say Shtia, you have to say Shtias HaKos. V'lo brachos greater. In other words, brachos is not going to clinch the mitzvah of Dalit Kosas for you. Very nice that you recited the brachos, but that's not the mitzvah of Dalit Kosas, which is Shtiyas HaKos. Ube'emes came shekein mevur blehedja b'loshen Rambam pergzayin alochazayin dekosa v'zel lishonu kol echad v'echad chayav lishtos ba'layla zeh arba kosa shel yayin. So the emphasis here on Shtias Arba Kosos. Hare the Ikar mitzvah he lishtos. Aval midivri atosis sheviu mikidush the gambi Arba Kosos shir Shtiasan he mole lugmov. If we kiddush the gamar bakosa shir Shtiasan he mole lugmov mevur desfirale the Dalit Kosos shavim bikardinam l'chol kol shel bracha. The hainu moshochiach adoni ovi etc. Reb Chaim v'shitosam desfirale the gamar bakosos ikar mitzvosim he habracha shal hakosos ushtiosam he rak mishum dina damavarch sakshi yitom kol kosos the kol kos bracha zo she hikshu mikiddush arba kosos. Oh, now on the left side, ulefiz near the zel bir divrei hagemara lefi ger saramam ve harif shegavish son vasachas dine de yedei cheres yotza. Oh, so let's try to think about that. He drank all 4 kosos bevasachas, and the Rambam says Yedei Cheres Yotza. Okay, Yedei Cheres Yotza doesn't bother me. That fits in beautifully with everything we've been saying. It's a shti of Dalit Kosos. But then the Rambam says Yedei Arba Kosos Lo Yotza. What's that all about? And now you're going to have to introduce. I don't think you have a way out. You're compelled, I think, to introduce Kosos Shel Bracha, and then you're going to have to say Tzvei Dinim. V'chein lehepach, gabi sheson chai yidei arba kosos yotza, yidei cheres lo yotza. Oh, the be'emes tarte isnu ba'mitzvah shel Dalit Kosos. Right, this is the tzvei dinim here. So again, the ikar mitzvah Dalit Kosos is going to be shtia, but we're going to have an additional kiyum of kos shel bracha. That's what I think is going to be the direction of Brisker Rav. What's going to bother me here is that we're talking about Yedei Cheres. I don't know what he means by Yedei Cheres here. Tehine, the Ikar mitzvah shel Dalit Kosos, I'm Barambam, blah, blah, blah. They b'chol dor v'dor chayv l'arasis atzma, v'fichak sh'soi b'layla zeh, tzorch lecha l'ishtos u'mesiv der Cheres, kol echad v'echad bein anoshim, chayav l'ishtos ba'arba, b'leil zeh, arba kos shel yayin, evozah. Hare. The zeu yisod hanach tarti mitzvahs teheseba v'dal kosos kidei sheyira atzmo derech cherus ki'ilu ba'atzmo yotza me'atem Mitzrayim. The ikar adover shemechuyav laharos es atzmo ki'ilu hu atzmo ba'atzmo yotza atem mishiv Mitzrayim mitzvah min haTorah. The tziyah kodesh baruch hu zechar together to Yisrael chacham tiknu b'shvil zeh heseba v'arba kosos t'shneim in Yonam who derech cherus v'zeu ikar mitzvahs. Makar dover zeh whom he divrei HaGemara b'Pesachim v'daf kuf tes v'daf kuf yud zayin arba kosi tkinu rabbana derech cherus harei d'zeu yisod hatakana v'mitzvah shel dal kosu b'shvil shei derech cherus. L'fi tam zeh harei l'chora pshita dashtia hi ha-mitzvah. That's more or less what we were saying. That how can you demonstrate cherus if you don't drink the kosos? The essence of Dalit kosos as cherus means to drink the kosos. Again, why you require brov kos, I still don't really understand. But I guess the mitzvah of derech cherus in this case was established as kos, as shtia min hakos. Tezeh derech cherus shebezel lishtos arba kos shel yain ulam harei zel lechol hashitos. That dalid kosos stricha lios kosos shel bracha. See, now he's trying to understand and justify why, in the case of Sheson Vas Achas, Yidei dalid kosos lo yotza. Why not? If the mitzvah is derech cherus with a seba, he drank 4 kosos. Was felt, as we say in Yiddish. What's missing? But the answer is, what's missing is that it's not just to take 4 kosos and drink them. It's got to be kosos shel bracha. I mean, now the situation is getting much more complex. It's like a hybrid. We've been avoiding kos shel bracha in the Rambam Shita, in the framework of the Rambam. So far the Rambam says, therefore he has to drink 4 kos shel yayin. There's nothing here about bracha. Which is, I think, the problem that the Amudei Hod was raising. Right, so he's making a big deal about that extra 2 words, derech cherus, kol chad v'chad ne'avid bei mitzvah. Oh, what does the avid bei mitzvah means? Bracha. Ratzalom. But the afagav, the ikar atakonos adal kosos, he b'shvil sheyeh derech cherus, which means shtia. Aval kach hois atakona, I'm sorry, sheyeh kol echad mehem, each one of these kosos has to be kos shel bracha. V'navid bei mitzvah. Again, not just to take out a bottle of wine from the fridge and take out 4 kosos from the closet, pour 4 kosos and drink them, that's not the mitzvah. But rather, kol chad v'chad ne'avid bei mitzvah, which means navid bei bracha. Oh, we got it. This is all based on Sheson Vasachas Yidei Dalid Kos Lo Yotza. Mishum Delo Sheson Al Seder HaBrachos. And the Rambam is not going to disagree with this. Right now, where is that in the Rambam? That's in the Rambam of Sheson Vasachas. It's very strange that the Rambam in Sheson Vasachas is telling us by intimation that you need that each one of the Daled Kosos should be a kos shel bracha. The Ayin Bagad Mishnah, for example, has come to Matzah shown the first Gam B'das Ramam came. The Hachdish Sheson Vasachas Piris the Shosar B'Kosos Chalukim, but Rakalo Al Seder. Right, because we had many different interpretations of what Sheson Vasachas means. So he's relying here on the Magid Mishnah that Sheson Vasachas in the Rambam is Shalo Al Seder, meaning without the brachos. was just thinking out loud, according to Rashi, for example, is b'vasachas means he poured them all into one cup. And if that be the case, then according to the Rambam, you have no proof that the Rambam requires that each kos be a kosher bracha. Some vasachas lo yotza, because he drank it all from one cup. That's why the Brisker Rav needs this Maggid Mishnah desperately. And that's why if he drank them all consecutively without brachos, he's not yotze. But again, it's so strange because he just finished saying that the ikar mitzvah, let me get that language again. In other words, which means shtia, but now he's saying the gam zeme ikar ha-mitzvah. To such an extent that the language of the Rambam is, and that's the language of the Shas, that if he drank them shalom aseder without the element of bracha, lo yotzi de daled kosos. Even though the ikar takana we said before was the shti of daled kos, which he fulfilled. El val korcha de gam zeh me ikar mitzvah. I'm going to underline those words. De gam zeh me ikar mitzvah. Shel daled kosos shiu arba kosos shel bracha utarte nichlu bahach mitzvah shel arba kosos. There are two dimensions that represent the essence of the mitzvah daled kosos. Chada, number one, mitzvah shtias arba kosos yain, and that's their cherus. Shnia, din arba kosos shel bracha gam zehu mi ikar mitzvah. He repeats himself. U'kmol das atosvus. I said Tosfos reduces it all to kosos shel bracha, and therefore moli lugmov is enough, and not everyone at the table has to drink. In the Rambam's frame of reference, we're talking about kosos shel bracha as an addition to the shtia, and therefore everyone has to drink, and it's got to be rov kos. Velkein zeu dekama begemara dim sheson chai after linyan din. Oh, now there's a problem here because sheson chai we said yidei cheres lo yotza. So I guess he's saying that when we talk about the mitzvah of shtias daled kosos, it's got to be kosos mezugim. After linyan din shel kosos shel bracha gam chai shaper dami. So the Gemara says in brachas that for kosos shel bracha you can use a concentrated wine that's chai and not mazur. The yotze ban yidei chovas arba kosos shel bracha. Yeah, but in daled kosos is an additional mitzvah of shtias hakos in order to demonstrate cherus, and that could only be fulfilled with yain mazur. Sounds like that's likuva. Yeah, but at this point, I would add another line, maybe it's coming up later, that he does fulfill the mitzvah of daled kosos shel bracha, I think. Or should we say no? That if the yayin itself is not roy to the ikar mitzvah of shtias derech cherus, then even the kosos shel bracha is not yotz. That doesn't make sense to me. So I don't know why he doesn't add that unless it's coming up later. Ulehepachim sheson vas'acha shelo sheson al seder harekim mitzvah shtia shemishum derech cherus v'yotzi yidei cherus al yidei arba kosos lo yotza. What does it mean lo yotza? He was yotze the mitzvah daled kosos shelo kiyim arba kosos shel bracha. I mean that's a little bit docham, to push that into the Rambam. U'kemotion inspired the tarte mili isnu. I would say the ikar mitzvahs arba kosos das Ram chada mitzvah shtias arba kosos shel yayin derech cherus The shenis din chovas arbakos shel bracha. And for this, it doesn't make a difference whether it's yain mozug or yain chai. Shal zehu dikoma gemaracha yidei arbakos yotza or lo yotza. So we wanted to finish the Brisker, but I see he goes on and on. Wow. I didn't realize how long this was. All right, so Bli Neder will try to pick this up next week. I just want to take one more minute of your time to read the Rambam. I have a Rambam here. So we're in Perek Zayin, Halacha Tes, correct? Perek Zayin, Halacha Tes. Right, he writes, Shas arbakos elu miyayin shenim mozug yotzi they arbakosos, which I guess means kosos shel bracha, according to the Brisker Rav. V'lo yotzi yidei cheres. So the zikr mitzvah shtia was established as a manifestation or a demonstration of cheres, and that requires yayin mozug. Shas arbakosos mizugim vas achas. So now what we have is Yidei Shtias Arba Kosos Yotza. And that's what the Ram means when he says Yidei Cheres Yotza. But Arba Kosos Yotza meaning Kos Shel Bracha. That you have to add those two words. Now, interesting. If we move to Halacha Hey, and now I'm talking out of the Garon of the Amudei Hod, in Halacha Hey, the Ram introduces the concept of bracha with regard to Dalit Kosos. And he establishes that Kol Kos v'Kos v'Arba Kos Halolo Mevarech Aleim bracha b'fnei atzma. Kos Rishon, Omer Lov Kiddush, Kos Sheni, Omer Lov Haggadah, Kos Shlishi, Birkas HaMazon, Kos Revi, Omer Lov Sahal. Interesting. It's only in Halacha Yud that the Rambam reveals the secret that every one of the four Kosos has a bracha of its own. How are we meant to understand then Halacha Tes, where Shesom Vas Achas, Yidei Abakos Lo Yotza, because it's not a kosher bracha? When the Ram hasn't even told me yet, hasn't even established and revealed yet, that each kos of Dalit Kosos has its own bracha. Very strange. And I'll tell you one thing about the Rambam. He's extremely sensitive to the Seder HaDvarim. He will never express and formulate one halacha that's based on a halacha that he will only in the future present us, because he expects you to understand each halacha as he presents it. And that's what the Amudei Hod was unhappy about in this Brisker Rav. Okay, so Bli Neder, after wishing you a great Shabbos, I would like to say that I would hope that we can finish the